So hello, everybody. My name is Samantha Hill, and I am the Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities here at Bard College. Welcome to our virtual reading group. Can everyone hear me okay and see me okay? Daphne, I see you nodding yes. Elias, Bob, thumbs up. Great. It's wonderful to see all of you again. So we're resuming our virtual reading group after a short summer pause, reading The Life of the Mind. I have this edition here. And we are in the middle of thinking. We are at the beginning of the third section, What Makes Us Think? And we have the first two sections for our discussion today. The first, the pre-philosophic assumptions of Greek philosophy, which is going to begin to offer one historical answer to the question, what makes us think? And then we have Plato's answer to the question and its echoes throughout the tradition of Western political philosophy. And then next time we'll move to the Romans. So what I thought I would do is just kind of take us through some of the main points in these two sections that we had for our reading today. And just kind of echo where we left off our discussion a few weeks ago when we took a small break. So Arendt is drawing a distinction in her work on thinking between knowing and thinking, and what it means to know something and what it means to engage in the process of thinking as an activity. And so she's beginning this section of the book by asking what makes us think. And she's going to move to the question, where are we when we think? And one of the things that she's doing in this book, which we've been talking about in the first two sections, is what she calls the dismantling of metaphysics. And there are a lot of different ways to read this, but it becomes quite important in these sections that we have here today, where dismantling metaphysics in part for Arendt means that we are not moving toward a transcendental realm of truth when we're talking about thinking, but rather she is trying to come to an understanding of thinking as the work of understanding that grounds us in the materiality of the world that we live in at this historical moment in time, right? So to put that in other terms, she wants us to come face to face with the world that we live in, right? We're not reaching for the truths of the philosophers like the Greeks did, which is where she's going to start this section, right? And this is a political claim for Arendt, and it's a claim she's making on the professional philosophers. Because if we try to critique the world that we're living in from ideas that are drawn from some transcendental realm of ideas and not the world as it appears before us and the problems we're dealing with, then the ideas that we're using to think about the world today are not going to be relevant, right, in the way that we want them to be. They're not going to have the power to critique the political problems that we're concerned with. And so part of Arendt's political claim in asking this question, what makes us think, is trying to stick our feet on the earth and make us look at what's before us, right? And so she's going to begin by talking about the tradition of Greek philosophy. And for the Greek philosophers in the first part of the section, what she argues is that they could not dissociate the question, what makes us think, from the idea of, and we see it on the bottom of page 129 here, of immortality, right? So she begins with what she calls this strange notion of immortalizing, right? And so if we go to let's just look at the first couple of passages on this first page on 129 in section 14. Our question, what makes us think, does not ask for either causes or purposes, right? Taking for granted man's need to think, it proceeds from the assumption that the thinking activity belongs among those energia which, like flute playing, have their ends within themselves and leave no tangible outside end product in the world we inhabit. We cannot date the moment when this need began to be felt, but the very fact of language and all we know of prehistorical times and of mythologies whose authors we cannot name give us a certain right to assume that the need to think is coeval with the appearance of man on earth. So for Arendt, the need to think is coeval with our appearance on earth. So when we appear in the world, when we begin breathing, we begin thinking. And to be alive for Arendt is to think. And she'll get into this in more detail in the coming chapters. But this idea of appearance, that we appear in the world, we stand out in the world, we come into being, right? And this is where she's going to end, thinking and being are brought together, right? That when to be is to think, right? And for the pre-philosophic, the pre-Socratic philosophers that she's talking about, the idea of thinking as an activity is tied to this idea of immortality, which means that for them, the idea of thinking isn't about just being in the world, right? The idea of thinking is about leaving the world, right? And so here we come back to her political critique, right? So she says on the next page, on page 130, she's going to talk about, what are the objects that appear before us that move us to this activity of thinking? And she says on the bottom of page 130 that the passion for seeing, preceding, as we have noted, the thirst for knowledge, even grammatically in the Greek language, was the basic Greek attitude to the world, seems to me too obvious to require documentation. So the passion for seeing, our need to see, this desire we have to see, comes before our desire to know. And whatever appeared, nature and the harmonious order of the cosmos, things that had come into being of their own accord, and those that human hands had led into being, as well as whatever human excellence Arendt brought forward in the realm of human affairs, was there primarily to be looked at and admired. What tempted men into a position of mere contemplation was the kalan, the sheer beauty of appearances, so that the highest idea of the good resided in what shone forth, and human virtue was assessed neither as an innate quality or intention of the actor, nor by the consequences of his deeds, only by the performance, by how he appeared while he was doing. Virtue was what we called virtuosity. So Arendt she's going to move to Plato's cave metaphor here, but she's drawing a distinction also throughout between those who engage in thinking, those who are spectators, those who want to see the action of what's going on in the world, and those who are in the action, those who are on the stage performing. And in our last meeting, we talked briefly about this distinction and what it means in Arendt's work. And just to kind of reiterate that and why it's important for Arendt here, for her, thinking is a form of activity that we engage in, right? And the activity of thinking itself ultimately is going to bear upon how it is that we act in the world as individuals. But here we have the philosophers trying to draw this sharp distinction between those who act in the world, who go out and do things, who are not engaging in this contemplation, this thinking, and then the philosophers, Thales in Plato's Theaetetus, who's so wrapped up in thinking that he falls down a well, right? That the activity of thinking literally has the power to remove you from this mortal plane so that you can draw yourself nearer to immortality, so that you can become godlike. Okay? And so for the ancient philosophers, to engage in the activity of philosophizing was not to do so in order to affect action in the world and the way that we are as people, but it was to become like gods. Right? It was to literally become like gods. You engaged in philosophy not to become a more critical thinker or self-reflective thinker, or to be able to speak more thoughtfully to the political problems that you're facing in the world, but because you could literally, through the act of philosophizing, of contemplating a philosophical object like the beautiful or the good, become godlike. You could transcend the mere realm of worldly appearances, and you too could ascend to the top of Mount Olympus to sit with Zeus, right? And so Arendt wants to she's knocking these philosophers down, is how I read this, right? This is part of her dismantling. She's staying in the tradition, but she's also moving us outside of it because she wants us to engage in the activity of thinking as an activity, and as an activity that's responsive to the world that we're living in today. And so then let's skip forward a little bit to page 133. In the first full paragraph on 133, she's going to draw our attention to the relationship between thinking and language and remembrance and the poets. So she says, to state this in conceptual language, the meaning of what actually happens and appears while it is happening is revealed when it is disappeared. Kind of sounds like a riddle, right? So the meaning of what actually happens and appears while it is happening is revealed when it disappears. So to just translate this before we go on, what Arendt is saying there is that you can't tell the story of what you've just seen until you've left the play, right? So you have the experience and you think about the experience and then you tell the experience in a story. And it's only once you've put that experience into a story, once the actual experience has disappeared, that you are actually able to, that it reveals itself, right? And so this is why remembrance is so important to Arendt, remembrance and the idea of storytelling, because for Arendt, there's a relationship between truth and meaning, right? And so here's this critique of the Greeks that we've been talking about that's coming through again in her idea of remembrance. So we're not after Platonic truth, right? For Arendt, we're not after the theory of forms and the ideal of the good and the beautiful that is transcendent of worldly affairs. For Arendt, we're after meaning. And we're thinking about how we, as human beings, get meaning from our everyday experiences in life. And Arendt is really fond of, I think, repeating the Isaac Dinesen quote, everything can be born if you put it into a story, right? So we go out into the world, we meet people, we talk to them, we have experiences, and when we go home, we represent those experiences to ourselves in our imagination. And in that process, we tell a story to ourselves about the experiences that we've had. And through that process of telling a story to ourselves about the experiences that we've had, we create meaning in our lives, right? And so that way, the meaning that we have through this process of remembrance and storytelling is attached to our lived experiences. It's not attached to some otherworldly ideal that we don't physically or sensually have access to, right? And so Arendt is turning us away from this Platonic notion of truth as something transcendent that we can reach through thinking, that this ought to be the goal of thinking, to this idea that through thinking we create meaning. Through the process of thinking and remembering and storytelling, we create meaning, and we create meaning not just for ourselves, but in our communities and for our lives. We tell ourselves stories, and we tell ourselves stories in common as well. And so she says, remembrance, by which you make present to your mind what actually is absent and past, reveals the meaning in the form of a story. The man who does the revealing is not involved in appearances. He is blind, shielded against the visible in order to be able to see the invisible. This is a common trope in the Greek tragedies and the classics, right? So I'm teaching I'm teaching Derek Walcott's Omeros right now in our first year seminar program, which is a rewriting of the Odyssey. My students ask me, well, how can the seer be blind, right? How can the soothsayer be the blind character? And we think of Tiresias, right? But so the person who is visibly blinded is the only person who can see, right? Who has access to seeing what is going on. For Arendt's doing a little bit of play here in writing those sentences, but what she's saying is that it's the spectator and the audience who writes the story of the battle, right? And that's the person who gets to create the meaning. The actor doesn't write the story, the actor on stage doesn't write a review of their own play, right? It's the critic and the audience who's going to tell the story of what they saw, and is going to create meaning out of it. So she goes on and says, and what he sees with blind eyes and puts into words is the story. It's the story. It's not the action itself. It's not the doer itself and not the doer. It's not the actual person, although the doer's fame will reach the high heavens. So this is also a bit of philosophical play here, right? She's saying it's not the actual person, right? It's a representation of the person that moves toward this high heaven, immortal fame, right? Memories, we represent experiences through the process of remembrance, and that is not to literally depict the other or what happened. It's a reading. It's a reading, which means it's not objective, which means it can't be crystallized as an object of truth, right? It's not a piece of factual knowledge. Who can I, Susan is up on my main screen right now, right? So Susan and I can go see the same play, right? And we can both tell a story about our experiences, and they're both going to be different from each other, but one isn't more or less true than the other necessarily. They're both experiences that move from our particular experience of what it is that we've just seen, and we're both creating meaning through sharing our experiences in that way. There's no crystallized truth that we can just say, well, this is how it is, right? Arendt is always pushing us to move toward understanding, and beginning to understand, not understanding as something that we can actually ever fully do, because the world is always changing. And she says, so out of this arises the typical Greek question: who becomes immortal? The doer or the teller? Odysseus or Homer, right? Or who depends on whom, right? The doer on the poet, who gives him fame, or the poet on the doer, who must first accomplish things that deserve to be remembered? We need only read Pericles' funeral speech in Thucydides to learn that the question remained controversial, the answer depending on who replied, the man of action or the spectator. In one of Arendt's poems that she wrote after the war, she writes 3 versions of it, and she answers this question in the poem, which is is kind of cheating, because I suppose it's her personal response to the question that she's raising here in this text for us. But she says, if it was not for the poets who first put, twisted sounds into words, we would not remember what was. And so she's drawing us to this, to thinking, but also important to remember in the human condition. Arendt says that poetry is the form closest to the thinking process itself. So poetry as a form of writing, is the closest we can get to actually putting our thoughts directly in a way down on paper, making thought things in the world that appear before us. Okay, so I'm going to forge ahead, and she talks about love, and we can come back to what you want to, but I just want to slide ahead to, let's go to Plato's Answers and its Echoes. And we've already touched on a bit of it. She's going to talk about Plato and the Symposium, and she's going to talk about the gods and Hegel briefly, and then she goes in Voltaire, and then she goes to Plato's Answer and its Echoes. And she's going to say that there's a transition that takes place between the pre-Socratics and Plato. So for the pre-Socratics, thinking is about becoming immortal through the process of thinking. And for Plato, thinking is going to be tied to the idea of being. So there's a transition that takes place between immortality and being, which is to say there's a transition here that takes place between immortality as being beyond being, right? And being, which is to be alive, right? And to exist in the world. And so the gods are replaced by philosophy. The gods are, and there's the rest of the Western tradition, and we can close the book and no, I'm joking. But the gods are replaced by philosophy, right? And so thinking and being become the same, and the gods aren't totally done away with, though, because they're both related to divinity for Arendt. And so I want to draw your attention briefly to the bottom of page 138 and 139, because Arendt does a little foreshadowing here, which becomes really important to the last part of thinking in chapters 4 and sections 4 and 5. So she says, it is in the first full paragraph we have there. She says, it is generally admitted that philosophy, which since Aristotle has been the field of inquiry into things that came after the physical and transcended them, is Greek in origin. And being, so metaphysics, literally what comes after the physical, metaphysique, right? And being Greek in origin is set itself the original Greek goal, immortality, which seemed even linguistically the most natural aim for men who understood themselves as mortals, for whom, according to Aristotle, death was the greatest of all evils, and who had as their kindred their blood relations, as we would say, drawing breath from one mother, the immortal gods. Philosophy did not change this natural goal. Okay. It only proposed another way to attain it. So she's talking about this transition. Right, so philosophy doesn't change the goal, but it proposes another way. Summarily speaking, the goal disappeared with the decline and fall of the Greek people and disappeared from philosophy altogether with the arrival of Christianity bearing its good news, telling men that they were not mortals, that contrary to their former pagan beliefs, the world was doomed to end, but they would be bodily resurrected after death. The last trace of the Greek quest for the everlasting may be seen in the Nunc Stans, the standing now of medieval mystics' contemplation. So Arendt is drawing us a line of tradition. Okay? And she herself feels free of the weight of tradition, so she's not attaining to any one tradition in her own thinking, and she makes that very clear. But she's offering us a way to think about thinking from the pre-Socratics to Plato to medieval philosophers and Christianity and so forth. Okay? And this idea of the Nunc Stans, this standing now of contemplation, is the idea that she is going to go back to in order to answer, where are we when we think? And she is going to, from this, develop her idea of the gap space between past and future. And so there's also a rejection of this Christian idea in the notion of life, everlasting, resurrection beyond death, right? She's turning away from this. She's turning away from the Greek idea of immortality, and she's turning us away from the idea as philosophers that we can transcend the material realm of human affairs to a higher plane that exists beyond this world. Right? And in order to get there, she's going to go back to this nunc stans, the last trace of the Greek quest for an everlasting. And it's going to be the space, this temporal spatial location, that is not located anywhere temporally. Specifically, it's going to be a kind of long now that flashes up, that exists between the forces of past and present. And this is how she's going to talk about the position of the thinking ego, the I that thinks, in section 4. Okay, so however, while the mighty incentive to philosophize disappeared, the topics of metaphysics remained the same and continued to prejudge, she says. So then if we slide down on page 139, and I'm just going to finish up here, she says, the originally divine metaphysical topics, the everlasting and the necessary, survived the need to immortalize through the mind's effort to stay and remain in the presence of the divine, an effort rendered otiose when, with the rise of Christianity, faith replaced thought as the bringer of immortality, and in a different way, the evaluation of spectatorship as the essentially philosophical and best way of life also persisted. Okay, and she's going to end by talking about these questions of metaphysics and why there is something instead of nothing, and the turn to the modern age. And the themes that she's bringing up here in this last section, the turn towards Christianity, faith replacing this form of thinking and philosophy, are also just aren't fun, where in part where she begins the human condition, right? And thinking about some of the primary shifts in thinking that have occurred in modernity that are reframing the way that we think about the world. So I've been talking, I think, for about a half hour, so I am going to pause. I see there are some questions in the chat box, and we can open it up for conversation. There's a lot in these 2 short sections. All right. So Jack. Hi, Jack. Jack writes, the Greek conception of the gods in their religion, which Arendt selects over divine characteristics in other religions, has found its way back into contemporary culture. Interesting. Huh, yeah. Okay, so recent scientific cosmological speculations project the notion that our universe is a programmed experiment being carried out by some unknown superior beings. It's not called the Olympus theory, but it ought to be. Jack, do you wanna say a little bit more?
Well,
I'm not sure who these divine beings are.
well, there have been. I don't know if you've read these news reports, but there is this line of thinking that has recently appeared that the world we live in is a program. The speculation around it is quite interesting because when an experiment fails, you abandon it. And so there is some thought that if we actually found out that we are part of an experiment, that those who are conducting the experiment would shut it down, because the whole idea is we should not be aware that we are part of an experiment.
I think I've
So, yeah, it was just recently reported, and there really are a number of people who are actually discussing this subject seriously. So I thought, well, there it is, the Olympus theory.
Yeah. It's interesting. So of course I think of, I think there was a slate of movies, I'm going to call them movies intentionally, not films, in the 1990s that were, about this idea. The Matrix comes to mind. What's the one with Jim
There's
Carrey?
the Truman Show. The Truman Show.
The Truman. I think it's I put this genre of speculation and the same kind of, I think in my thinking, I put it next to like fantasies about world destruction and, you know, those films that we enjoy watching as well. And I think it actually, it's interesting as a form. I think it cuts to this line that Arendt repeats here in the first section we had for today, that our desire to see precedes our desire to know, our thirst to know, right? So there's something, if we, where she's talking about, let's see if I can find the, there's a really, yes, so on page 140, on 140, she's talking about Voltaire reading Lucretius and what this desire to see represents. And, you know, what would it mean? What would it mean if there were these invisible gods playing with us as some kind of experiment to see what we do? And I think another interesting question would be to kind of turn it around and ask why we're asking that question and what our asking of that question represents about our own will as people in the world. Why do we have this kind of speculative fantasy that maybe we're being toyed with and that things are beyond our control in a certain way? And this speaks directly to the whole second volume of The Life of the Mind, which is the question of willing, which Arendt wants to draw near to the activity of thinking in order to address the problem of evil and evil in the world. And I love this little paragraph on 140, where she's talking about Voltaire. She says, it was left to Voltaire to draw conclusions from Lucretius's proposition. According to him, the desire to see is nothing but cheap curiosity. Nothing but cheap curiosity. It attracts people to the spectacle of a ship about to be shipwrecked. It drives people to climb trees or look at the massacres of battle or attend public executions. And this passion, according to Voltaire, man shares with monkeys and young dogs. In other words, if Lucretius is right, and man's passion for seeing spectacles is due solely to his sense of safety, then the sheer lust for seeing can be ascribed only to an immature, irrational drive that endangers our very existence. The philosopher for whom Lucretius speaks will not need to see the shipwreck to be warned against entrusting his safety to the wildness of the sea.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, you ask why are we thinking this way, and I think it's all Frankenstein. I think there is. I really think that there is this fear that people that has now accelerated to a tremendous extent, a fear of the impact of the things that we ourselves make. And this particular thing is all comes out of artificial intelligence and when the robots take over and so on and so forth, which is like, our humanity gets lost in this by, if you're a Christian, by this evil thing that you've done, and if you're rational, by this activity that is that you need to grasp the meaning of, in addition to the fact of it. So Frankenstein is an attempt to find meaning in scientific change, and I think that that's what all of this other stuff is.
Yeah, I think to draw it to the question of meaning that Arendt's presenting us with here, that makes sense in a lot of ways. And people are, we can say that people are afraid today, that people don't feel like they have a sense of safety, that our political institutions are wobbly right now, that there's unprecedented violence and unpredictable violence, and that there's a correlation between this general sense of unsafety we feel and our fantasies about technology and gods replacing us, or telling us what to do in certain ways, or keeping an eye over us. But I think I think that correlation exists, but I think there is this kind of cheap, it's not cheap because the cost is immense, but there's this kind of desire that people have to see violence. People want the curtain to be pulled back and to be shown, I think, in a certain way that everything is then a play or a lie, because that would absolve them of responsibility to a certain extent. And then they don't have to think about the problem of will. They can say, aha, see, it didn't matter anyway that we let the planet burn, or so on. Now, at the same time, we do live at this in this moment of social media, digital technology, and if I was going to put on my Frankfurt School hat, a good, some kind of perhaps Adorno reading would say, well, actually, all of your decisions are pre-programmed for you by the formulas that advertising agencies are using to advertise certain goods to you or movies to you. Even newspapers now, we can both pull up the same newspaper and we'll see different stories, because the stories that we're seeing have been tailored to our preferences. And so our preferences, at least when we're strapped to these machines, are being dictated to us to a large extent, but they're also being shaped by our activity of what we click on and what we do and how we spend our time on these computers. But I think, that's also not a kind of gotcha. We're participating in this age of digital technology as well, I think. To a certain extent. We could spend a year more. Savannah says, yes, I want to go. There's a lot of questions. Her interesting point about the divine qualities of spectatorship perhaps suggests that Arendtian citizens, that's what I just said, that Athenian citizens watching plays in their theaters thought of themselves as engaged in a kind of divine activity, rather unlike modern playgoers. Do you want to say more about that, Elias, before I?
Well, I think it's interesting. It's just a historical point.
Yes.
You wonder, did that last as long as the Roman Colosseum? And the other thing I was thinking is, what is there any relationship we could discover between Arendt's idea of this divine spectatorship and the society of the spectacle?
Yeah.
Speaking in combination, but I wonder how we got from one to the other.
Yeah. I was thinking of the Gita board, Society of the Spectacle. I was in Pompeii last week. I was at Pompeii, and I did one of these tour things, which I never do, and I hate them, but Pompeii is so massive, so I was just kind of like wandering in and out and kind of picking up what I could. But we were looking at the theaters, and one of the things that I was struck by, and that, it's a kind of common sense thing, so it should be more apparent than it is that the way that theater goers went to the theater in Greek and Roman times is very different than the way that we go to the theater today, and in a number of different ways. So plays were always put on when there was light outside, so there's no play after dark because there would have been no lights for the stage, right? Was one of the easy ones. The other is the way that, the audience is socio and politically distributed throughout the audience, so you can see the different sections and the different theaters. And they had different theater spaces for different types of theater that were being performed. They were set away from the temple spaces, but in the hallways where they would have the gladiator fights, they would etch they're still etched in. The ancient graffito is still there of who won and the names of the victors and the number of battles they won. And so there is a kind of written remembrance in the Arendtian sense, which is her way of understanding the divine. But the theater goers were also more engaged participants in the play. They weren't expected to go there and be perfectly still and silent in the way that we often are when we go to, not all plays are like this, but when we just go to and sit and watch a show, they were more of a communal event in a certain sense. And I think, where I'm trying the society of the spectacle, and I don't know what it would mean to say that who would be these overlords today who are watching down on us? The NSA, advertising corporations on Madison Avenue who are mining our digital data in order to maximize their profit margins and get us
the originators of hyper-reality.
Yes.
Kind of a new media universe where the truth is fabricated.
Yes. Arendt
Something
actually. Yes, it's a great question. Arendt actually talks about this a little more directly in her essay, Culture and Politics, which is in the Thinking Without a Banister volume, and a bit in her essay on Crisis of Culture. She talks about it in terms of mass culture. So she sees it in part as an invasion of the private realm and the public realm, the collapse of the private realm and the public realm, and what is lost when we have these kinds of mass marketing strategies. For her, what's lost is plurality and uniqueness. But I think she's looking. This is a kind of critical way to think about spectatorship and what spectatorship has become in our contemporary society. But we also, she's thinking about spectatorship here as a form of storytelling. So our spectators are poets.
Good point. Yep.
They are novelists. I don't want to say they're the people writing the op-eds these days, so I'm going to stay away from that one. But they're the people who tell the stories about what's going on in communities and in everyday life, and through that process of storytelling give us a sense of meaning, and which is for Arendt never to claim some kind of universalizing truth, right? We never actually get there because it's always changing. The world's always changing. So we always need people to be telling stories. But we can get a sense of meaning. And I think today, just to go back around, in our contemporary culture, we're experiencing a loss of meaning. There's a kind of existential crisis that we're facing today where people have lost a sense of meaning. The loneliness in unprecedented numbers, which for Arendt forecloses the ability to think, suicide or unprecedented suicide rates, the drug epidemic. This is. I think that there was an article I read last week about how Americans don't go to church anymore. I'm not sure that's a good thing. That people are losing the sources of meaning in their life. And we need
social isolation certainly comes up in Origins.
Yes.
It's a key driver. Absolutely.
That's where she ends at the end of Origins. She says that loneliness is the undercurrent, the common ground of all totalitarian movements, of all fascist movements. When people feel cut off from the world, from one another, when they lose their sense of meaning in the world, sense of place and belonging, they become susceptible to ideological rhetoric, which gives them meaning. Because ideology's the opposite of Arendtian understanding. Ideology says, well, I know what the problem is, and this is why, and it's very easy. And, the simple explanation that takes care of everything. It's how she understands or defines ideology.
So, Sam, one aspect of ideology I think that we need to remember is that it is a form of storytelling. And if we think of it as a form of storytelling, then we can see the connection between the use of ideology for mass hypnosis, if you like, and why it occurs. All ideologies hearken to some past, especially totalitarian ideologies, but all of them do, and they create a meaning, which, as you pointed out, is very quickly grasped and absorbed by people who are hungry for meaning and are not finding it in their world.
Absolutely, it's a really great point. And one of the most controversial things I find myself saying, talking about politics in America right now, is I often find myself repeating that Trump actually knows what he's saying, right? This is not unintentional speech. He knows his voters, and he knows the stories they tell themselves, and he tells those stories back to them, and that gives them a sense of meaning, and he's very good at it. And I think you're absolutely right, Jack. We have to think about, if we're thinking about the contemporary, let's say, story of a liberalism, which we talk a lot about, the rise of a liberalism worldwide. Well, that looks different from Brazil to Poland to Hungary to the United States. And those forms of a liberalism are telling stories about our contemporary political and social conditions that have great appeal to the people who are voting for those political leaders. They're telling stories about isolation, about failing economy, about the threat of immigrants, about the need for border security, about the need for more local industry and jobs, which speaks directly to people who are, who work 2 or 3 jobs, who are working in various industries, who don't have employment, who don't live on the East and West Coast respectively, and so on. And I think that's probably one of the most powerful rhetorical tools Trump has at his disposal, is he knows that story, and he motivates his base with it, and he irritates the hell out of liberals with it.
Sam?
Susan, yes?
So really what I'm getting is that we somehow have lost the ability to create meaning in our own lives, and now we have people who create that meaning for us and do that interpreting for us. And so when there's a mass shooting and somebody says, oh, this is people who are crazy, that's creating one meaning. Whereas other people are saying, no, this is a totally out of control use of weapons. So we have people creating those meanings. And
yes.
Apparently that works in a lot of situations.
Yeah. Margaret, did you want to jump in too before I respond to Susan? Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to also ask if this sort of, to Jack's point, and to what you were saying earlier about poetry, the way to be susceptible to these stories, and I hate to say it, but I agree with you about Trump, the way one is susceptible is that one is not aware of storytelling that has gone on in the past describing these sorts of personae and these sorts of movements. So, if you have not either studied history or read poetry or read, fiction where this, the way in which such people arise in history and tell these stories can be put into a context of, oh, gee, there's a bunch of this sort of thing happening, then it seems very, current. It seems to be speaking, oh, just to me, just today, just to my situation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, yeah, those two points go together. So I think there's at least two things. One is, so we let other people tell our stories for us. We let other people tell our stories for us. I was talking with a colleague about this last night and the context of Me Too and the way in which women's stories, which are all unique and particular and specific to their own experiences, just become rolled into a kind of dominant political narrative that reduces every unique experience to one overriding experience. And so one question I think we have to ask ourselves today, and that's just one example, I think there are many. One question we can ask is, how can we retain that particularity of experience and to tell our stories for ourselves? But I think that's incredibly dangerous to do, and I think it's incredibly difficult to do, because when you push back against the popular narrative, oftentimes you get yelled at, you get criticized, you get told you're wrong, you get told that, well, you're not with us, you're not part of the, we're fighting a political battle here, and, you have to be on board. And if you try to retain that sense of your own experience, then you get pushback. But I think what people miss sometimes is the nuance of that. To say that, if we're just taking Me Too as an example, that, each person has a unique and particular experience doesn't mean that we can't have a common collective cause, right? That doesn't mean that we can't have a kind of solidarity, but it means that it's not ideological. Right? It means that we don't have a 3-point plan and we're sticking to this at the cost of everything, right? And however that may look. And so I think we have to take back, I hate that phrase, but we have to tell our stories for ourselves, right? We have to tell our stories for ourselves, but that requires that we engage in this Arendtian process of self-reflective critical thinking, small c critical thinking, and that's hard to do. It's hard to do, and it's often quite painful to do, I find, just as a person who tries to be a thinking person in the world. We don't always want to do that, and it can be challenging. And one of the things, that Arendt talks about is in relationship to thinking is solitude. Right? One of the great cliches about writers is that they are lonely people who live solitary lives. Right? Thinking requires solitude. It requires that we're okay with going and thinking about something in order to come to understanding of our experience ourselves in the world. And that's just part of it. I think there's a lot more to say. The other side of what I think Susan and Margaret were raising is, Margaret, I'm trying to remember there's something else. I just lost my thread in thinking, my thought train. The second part of what you were talking about in Arendt. Do you want to remind me, or I can go on? We might come back to it.
That the importance of poetry and of the storytellers is precisely that we can look back to contextualize our particularity within some general historical train, I guess, in short.
Yes, thank you. Yes. I didn't want to lose that, and I couldn't quite wrap around. So for Arendt, she says at the beginning, I think a good example of this, she says at the beginning of the origins of totalitarianism that, this book is not all encompassing, and it's also not a guide, right? It's not that we can hold up Origins and here are the 36, 42 points of totalitarianism that we can map onto our current present reality. So we can read history, we can read text, we can read stories, but they're not going to map onto our specific present moment. What they can do is be a kind of guidepost for us, or guidepost that help us in our thinking about reality. The important part of that question, I think, for Arendt, Margaret, is that when we read these stories, when we read these poems, when we read novels and nonfiction, narrative accounts, and so on, the more we read, the more we expand our imagination in the Kantian sense, right? We expand our capacity to understand. We expand our capacity to have empathy, and we expand our capacity to be more discerning thinkers, right? And this is the dangerous part of ideology, is that it only tells one story, right? There's only the ism. This is how it is. There's only one story. And if you engage in, common political conversations with people, you get to a point sometimes where it's like, that's not the way it is. And you're like, well, but, maybe it could be otherwise. And you hit a kind of wall and a capacity to imagine something other than it is. That something could be otherwise. So we need the poets, we need the storytellers, not just so that we can remember, which we need them for that, that's very important, but we also need them in order to become better thinkers, to become better at discerning, to have a greater capacity for judgment in the world. And that's what they help us do. And they share experiences with us that we might not otherwise have ourselves, right? And so Arendt's picking up the Kantian idea here of what it means to have an expansive imagination, to go wandering, to be able to, for a moment, lose yourself in a poem or a book and see the world through the eyes of the character that you're reading, or the narrator, or so on. And that's very important for Arendt here. I think the other part of that is the work of poets who engage in the process of poesis, which literally means making, to make. And poets make the world, right? We live on Earth and we make the world in common. And poets make things. And they don't just make things for Arendt, they make thought things. Because poetry is the closest form we have to thinking itself. And so to read a poem, to write a poem, is to make something that is quite different than to write even an editorial in Arendt's understanding. It's a way of drawing out the thinking process into the world so that it appears before us as a thing that we can engage with, which for Arendt is, I think, even more so after the war, in her own writing and her thinking journals and her poetry, is essential to having a sense of durability and stability and safety in the world when the world is not durable, not safe, and not stable. Poetry becomes a kind of place of home for Arendt in the language of poetry, in the language of German poetry for her specifically. But it is, as she says to Günter Gauss, what remains when everything else has been taken away. We have the words of the poets. And at the end of On Revolution, she says it's the poets who make and keep the words we live by. Okay? The poets make our language and keep our language. They keep the storehouse of memory, which allows us to have a sense of continuity in the world, in the break in tradition, in the break in modernity, and in the break that's felt by the present political circumstances of the time that she's writing in, the horror of the Holocaust and the Second World War, and also our political moment today, which is one that I think earlier I called wobbly as well. So that was a long answer, Margaret, but poetry is my soft spot in Arendt, so I can go on and soft spots. That's what I enjoy talking about most. So, all right, let me slide up in our chat box. There's a lot of questions.
Excuse me. Huh? Hello.
Hi, Howard. You want to jump
Hi.
in? Hi.
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to point out that in our society,
Mm-hmm.
the conversation is the political conversation is extremely limited. There are all kinds of things that are taboo. You can't talk about common ownership, being in common. You can't talk about degrowth. You can't talk about Bernie Sanders yesterday got chastised for talking about the population problem. And we don't study and we don't learn about what's happening in other parts of the world. I've been recently reading a lot of thinkers from Latin America. It's a whole different perspective that we don't get. And so one of the things that we have to do, it seems to me, rather than confronting within the terms of a very narrow political spectrum, is at least develop communities locally, and even if that locality is virtual, where you can have these discussions, where we can expand ideas. And I think that's one of the things that's lacking, and it's one of the problems that we have.
Yeah, I agree with you, Howard. And I saw that the long and the short list for prizes in translation was released a couple weeks ago, and I was thinking how many of us read outside of our given locality, our given area, and how much we should be reading authors from other parts of the world, and expanding our imagination and understanding of the world in that way as well. I think you're right too with the first part, that it's difficult to talk about a collective we today, in a certain sense, because we're living in an age of hyper individualism. And this hyper individualism, ironically enough, is the opposite of Arendtian plurality, because it flattens people to what they are and doesn't encourage what she calls who-ness, right? It doesn't encourage this kind of thinking. It allows people to kind of double down on the immediacy of how they identify themselves in the world and how they name their own appearance. They try to take charge of that spectatorship themselves, right? They tell their own story. And we hear this. This is actually part of the political lingo of the moment around identity politics, is that you tell your story, right? And Arendt is giving us a very different framework for understanding appearance and community and solidarity here, which relies on plurality and who-ness and moves us away from the immediacy of individualism and affective empathy. Oh, I agree with that. So to forms of thinking, let's see, I'll go back up to so did you want to respond to that, Howard, or should I I can keep going through the chat box. I don't want to cut you off. I can't tell.
Only just to say that I'm in the struggle. I happen to be close to you from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is not where I live.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I came here, interestingly enough, is because I found someone on Facebook who has a very interesting point of view, and his particular concern is overpopulation. And I didn't come here solely for that, but it seemed to me to be an interesting place to visit. And he was here, and we've now met, and we've had some very interesting conversations. And we've both have had the experience of when we talk to other people, and
Yes.
we try to raise questions about systemic questions, something that goes beyond the system, and questions, well, is this system that we have for politics, for social, for being a human?
You cut out, Howard. Your audio is a bit fuzzy, and you just cut out, so I can't hear you. So
Oh, can you hear me now?
yes, I
Okay. So what I'm saying is his experience and my experience is when we try to talk to people about systemic change or anything that's deeper than what you read on the front page of the New York Times,
right,
no one wants to talk about that.
right.
It's very hard to have that conversation, and yet that conversation is critical.
I think it's critical to have that conversation. I think what I've been experiencing in the past couple of years since Trump was elected is that people are very reticent to have those conversations, especially in this political climate. And people do, I mean, we're getting two polar ends of the spectrum in a certain sense, because on the one hand, people feel licensed and liberated to now say all sorts of anti-Semitic and racist things in public spaces, which otherwise had been, at least it appeared, confined to a more private space in Arendtian terms. But at the same time, people are not willing to engage in public conversations where they actually share what their opinion is, because they feel like they have to curb their language so that they don't get attacked like Bernie Sanders is attacked for saying something, that might be read as off in some way. And that shuts down conversation. That shuts down political conversation. It doesn't open it up. So we have this powder keg of public discourse right now where if you are brave enough to step into public and say what you are actually thinking and share your opinion, you're probably going to get yelled at either way, because you're never going to make everyone happy. And you shouldn't try, but most people in Arendtian terms don't have the courage to do that. She says in The Human Condition, the virtue of politics par excellence is courage, because when you step into public and you share your opinion, you make yourself vulnerable. And today, to do that, to make yourself vulnerable means you might get fired, you might never get another writing job, you might not be, and so on. It's not just a disagreement. Your whole life is put on the line, and everything that you perhaps have worked for as an individual. I'm going to go back up to the chat box because it's about 2:10 and I see about 20 questions in here. Jason asks, he's on page 137, also the distinction between nous and logos. So he says, there seems to be two manners of thought suggested in the section, yes, nous and logos. So nous appears to be indistinguishable from wonder. Logos is a form of making rational attempt to set patterns. Logos appears to have some durability if the rational result is turned into a methodology. Does this suggest logos to be work, whereas labor, so you're trying to put the human condition categories of labor and work onto the distinction between nous and labor. And then there seems to be so it's the same thing. So let's look at the first full paragraph on page 137, and I won't read the whole thing, just take a look at a couple of parts. At any rate, to the Greeks, philosophy was the achievement of immortality, and as such it proceeded in two stages. The first was the activity of nous, which consisted in contemplation of the everlasting, and was itself anu logos, speechless. Then followed the attempt to translate the vision into words. So here we have this relationship, again, that Arendt's focusing on here between our desire to see and our thirst for knowledge. So there's a relationship between seeing and our thirst for knowledge, our desire for knowledge. And when we are initially drawn to an object of contemplation, and she says this, I think it's in a couple of pages earlier, we're drawn by wonder and by beauty, right? We're actually stunned by the beauty of a thing, right? We want to, I think we probably all have had that experience as people, you know, you look at something and then you want to look again and again and again, and there's something there and you want to see what's there, and then you try to put language to it, you try to understand it, and that's logos. So she's talking about that relationship between the rational activity of thinking and speaking and putting language to something and naming it in that way so that you can know it, and the more affective, physical, embodied experience of that initial philosophic wonder and being kind of stunned by an object of the beautiful. The beautiful, of course, in philosophical terms, representing a form of truth, right? In contemplating these truths. I wouldn't map, Jason, I wouldn't map work and labor onto these, although I see where you're going. I mean, the thinking for Arendt, I wouldn't do so simply for the reason that thinking for Arendt is an activity, doesn't exist within means-ends categories, which is part of what she's trying to escape here. And for her, both labor and work operate according to certain logics. So labor is not productive of anything. It replicates biological life cycles. But classically, philosophically, wonder and contemplation of the beautiful is to actually get outside of the body in that way as well. But also, you know, work is something that makes something stable in the world, like architecture or poetry, is productive. And for Arendt, thinking is never productive. So I see where you're going with that mapping, but I would push against it for those reasons. I'm not sure if you want to respond. If not, I will keep going through.
No, I think that's good. Thanks.
Did I answer your question, Jason?
Yeah, you did. Last time we talked, we kind of threw thinking into the camp of labor. I got very excited because I had long since been putting it inside this constructive mindset. And so now when I saw nous being introduced, I'm like, okay. Maybe there is a further distinction, but it sounds like you're saying, no. All this stuff is outside of our political necessity of maintaining the polis.
Yeah. Yes. Good. I'm sorry to crush the dreams of labor and thinking. Savannah writes, what does Arendt mean by understanding if meaning is subjective? Her point, that's a good question. Her point that the meaning is what actually happens and appears while it is happening is revealed and then it has disappeared. Sounds like the idea that if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. She seems to be equating meaning with perspective and how we perceive the world and disregarding what actually is. Am I understanding her correctly? What would she say in response to a tree example? Well, I try not to do the Arendt magic 8-ball, I know what Arendt would say sort of thing, but you're right in the sense that she's certainly responding to some of these classic problems in metaphysics about the relationship between being and appearance. And so one of those examples is, well, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to see it or hear it, has it actually fallen, right? Or, you know, does the table exist because we have the word table that has been named to it, or does it exist prior to the linguistic act of naming? So Arendt she's responding to these questions here Well, let me start with the first part of your question because it's essential to Arendt's project, as I understand it. Understanding is something that we are always after, right? So the phrase that I use when talking about Arendtian understanding is that we are beginning to understand, because we're constantly beginning the process of understanding over and over and over, which is different than the process of acquiring knowledge in a certain sense. So for understanding, it's subjective in the sense that it's responding to our particular experiences of the world, right? But it's not categorical, and it's not universalizing. So when she is in the first preface to the Origins of Totalitarianism, she talks about the work of understanding, and she talks about the work of comprehension. And understanding is a way of looking at the various elements that phenomenally appear before us and can crystallize together without telling a kind of traditional narrative story from point A to point B, which would offer us a way to know what happened, right? So we can say because X happened, Y happened. And Arendt's pushing against that kind of linear storytelling. She wants to say that nothing is so reducible to a simple point of authority in that way, that actually there are various things in terms of totalitarianism that merged together, that crystallized in order to produce the phenomenal appearance of totalitarianism in the 20th century. And so understanding in Arendtian terms is a strike against universalizing narratives and traditional narrative forms that create meaning. So her point that the meaning of what actually happens and appears while it is happening revealed when it has disappeared. There's a bee in the office. What she means is that we have the experience in the world, and so the meaning of what actually happens and appears while it is happening is revealed. That what actually is happening in the experience of the moment is only revealed to us once that experience has disappeared, right? So if you're a writer, perhaps a common experience of, or you read a text or you're writing a term paper, you have the experience of reading a book. And while you're having the experience of reading the book, you have not yet constructed the story that you're going to tell yourself about your experience of reading the book. It's only once that experience of reading the book has disappeared that you begin to engage in that process of remembering, literally, the experience of having read the book and tell yourself a story about what reading that book meant to you. And so that's what she's playing with, the appearance and the disappearance. The meaning appears once the experience disappears, and the meaning appears through the process of storytelling and the way that we tell those stories to ourselves. Okay, so Savannah, did I answer your question? Do you want to respond there? Okay, so Daphne writes, if meaning is derived from remembrance, oh good, so or from telling oneself the story, how does Arendt account for meaning when there is absolutely no remembrance involved? What do you mean, Daphne, when there's no remembrance involved? We're constantly remembering. If we run out of memories, what do we have to think about? And then if we don't have anything to think about, we die.
Okay, so there's a whole string of discussion on this below my comment. So if you want to just go scan through it, because my problem isn't so much the process that she's unfolding, or the fact that I can remember the experience of reading and then it becomes meaningful to me. I understand what you're saying, but what I don't understand is when the narrative that other people tell us, and let's say it's propaganda or whatever,
Okay.
is told us so often that we then internalize it and we think we're remembering it. We're remembering it from others. We're not actually remembering our own experience. And then it has meaning. So there's a kind of a circular element here to how memory actually, or remembrance actually works. I mean, I understand that we don't necessarily, as actors in the play, understand what's going on until later.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense to me. But if you look through some of the comments that are made, you can see where there's been an argument going on while you guys have been
Chatting. So for the people who will watch the video, it's not too long. I'll just read through it quickly and then we can respond, because you're raising an important and difficult question. So Katie, it's definitely, are you referring to how remembrance is faulty or unreliable, or do you have something in mind like when the stories we tell don't have truth relation to the world? For example, white nationalist supremacist concerns about their own disappearance, and then mostly the latter, like the horrendous reality of children in cages. What memory do we have of such things? And then Nietzsche, the trend for transparency points for an idea of suspicion that there is much going on behind us. So we're back to that conversation. Okay.
go down to Jack's comment, and then it continues from there.
Daphne, remembrance refers to actual prior experience, but not necessarily direct memory. Children in cages call forth images of animals in cages. So meaning is derived from spectating, I believe from seeing and thinking on it. So the first example that comes to my mind, I want to come back to the conversation. The first example that comes to my mind is Adolf Eichmann, in looking at this, which we perhaps can take as an example. When Arendt was asked why she went to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann for the New Yorker, she said because she wanted to see him. She said that she wanted to see evil in the flesh, and that she wanted to come face to face with one of the last, executioners of Hitler's regime. Arendt had that, that desire, that relationship between seeing and telling and meaning that we've been talking about. She had that desire to see. She wanted to see him. She wanted to have the experience of coming face to face with Eichmann, and having that experience in order to talk about it, in order to begin to understand evil in the world today and what that means, and what happened. So there's a relationship between the two. Now, to go to your example, I haven't gone to the border to one of these detention centers. I have a political opinion about them, right? We form political opinions and we have ideas about the world that are not always necessarily directly informed by the immediacy of our own experiences, which is why for Arendt it is essential to expand our imagination and to read and see as much as we can get our hands on, right? To get outside of our own little news bubble, for example, or the kinds of books or magazines we always read, but to read Breitbart, to watch Fox News, to listen to political commentary from across the perspective, and to engage all opinions. And in that way, we sharpen our own ability to have political opinions. But I think as Katie might have been implying, Arendt talks about this in Truth in Politics as well. These stories that become so embedded in the mass imagination have the ability to profoundly shape the reality of the world we live in. And those stories are not necessarily reflections of reality. So what does that mean? When you have, so the example that Arendt famously gives in Truth in Politics is, well, you can say that Trotsky never existed, right? Or Trotsky was killed, or that's, this country was invaded then. You can literally rewrite history, and you can rewrite history to such an extent that people forget what actually happened. And people do this. People do this in order to push a political agenda, and they do this they do this conflating, right? This is one of the key elements of totalitarianism. People the collapse between fiction and fact, right? Which is why factual truth for Arendt is so essential to the common good, to the realm of worldly affairs. We need.
That's why, Sam, that's why this is so important to me, this point, and I know I'm belaboring it in this discussion here on the site, on the chat box, but my work is about refuting revisionist history. And so, the idea that she has, which is a very profound, idea of how do we create meaning, and it's so contingent on remembrance, but remembrance itself can be so easily manipulated. And what we're seeing today is the manipulation of memory and morals and everything.
Yes, and that's why I started with Eichmann and moved to Truth in Politics, and that's why Arendt is writing this book, The Life of the Mind, I think, in a lot of ways. She begins by reflecting on the stories that were told misleadingly about her reportage on Eichmann, right? That's where she starts thinking. And she wants to confront them, but part of her political project here is thinking about the claim that thinking can prevent evil in the world. And it's not just everyday thinking like what's going on my grocery list and what do I have to do when this reading group's over and who, it's this self-reflective thinking where we actively engage in a process of remembrance, and we create meaning through storytelling, and we expand our imaginations by looking through the eyes of as many people and perspectives as we possibly can. And for Arendt, this is why thinking, willing, judging. This makes us better at judging. This makes us better at discerning. Discerning what? Discerning the distinction between fact and fiction, right? So that we become more active, engaged people with sharpened political opinions, right? Opinions aren't truths, right? But we can sharpen our political opinions, and our ideas and our political opinions can better reflect the immediacy of our own political circumstances in this historical moment. But in order to do that, we have to learn how to judge. And in order to judge, we have to know how to think. And this problem that you're raising, now I'm belaboring it, Daphne, is, between fact and fiction and truth and revisionist history and the stories we tell ourselves is, I think, essential, especially to this political moment, where I think 2 days ago, the President of the United States literally took a Sharpie marker and redrew a national weather report so that it better reflected the comments that he had already made about the trajectory of a hurricane. This is preposterous, right? And this is something that we are dealing with. And the frightening thing about that is that it doesn't make his voters suspicious. It doesn't make them turn away from him. It actually makes them support him more. It actually makes them fonder of him, right? This distinction between fact and fiction becomes a political instrument of political rhetoric that is appealing to people who want meaning. That's my opinion. But we have 1 minute left, and there's some comments about Boris Johnson at the end. I'm gonna skip over those. So Daphne, I'll just end with this last point.
Sam,
Yeah.
can I just say, you have no idea over there how lucky you are with Trump. Just get a dose of Johnson. My God, I thought you were in trouble with Trump till we got Johnson over here. Okay, look at him. Trump is fine, lads. Love him.
All right, Connell. So I think that's a good note to end on. We're going to pick up with storytelling. We're not done with the section of the book and why we think we're going to go to a couple other answers in the tradition of Western political philosophy in our next sessions. Thank you for reading Hannah Arendt with us. Keep reading Hannah Arendt, and I look forward to talking to you next time. Thank you, everyone, for a great discussion.
Thanks.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sam.